Normandy, July 1944. After weeks of brutal fighting, the front lines in western France inch slowly eastward. The town of Saint-Lô lies in ruins. Mud, rain, and smoke have turned the land into a lunar wasteland. Everywhere, a mixture of steel, fire, and exhaustion. On a narrow country road, between shattered Shermans and burned-out Tigers, a German reconnaissance group finds something unusual: an intact but abandoned M4 Sherman. The tank stands at an angle, partly in a ditch. The turret is jammed, the armor bears the marks of glancing hits, but the tracks are undamaged. On its sides, the faded inscription reads, "C Company, 3rd Armored." Oberleutnant Kurt Schäfer, an engineer by training and commander of a field repair unit, is the first to approach. He examines the armor, opens the hatch, and finds everything in order inside. Everything is in its place: ammunition, medical kit, a map, even a box of rations. The Americans, he thinks, left in a hurry, but they left it tidy. He gives the order: "Secure the vehicle, check for mines. I want it intact." The mechanics hook the Sherman to a Famo half-track. Despite its nearly 30-ton weight, the machine moves surprisingly smoothly. Transmission intact, brakes functional, steering responsive. One of the soldiers mutters, "Damn, it still drives." Thus begins the story of one of the strangest German trophies of the summer of 1944, a tank that would make engineers rethink everything they thought they knew about the machinery of war. In July 1944, Normandy was littered with wrecked vehicles. Each side strove not only to destroy the enemy's machines, but to study them. The Germans had already tested captured T-34s and British Churchills, but American tanks remained a mystery. At the time, the Wehrmacht considered the Sherman mediocre, weaker than the Tiger, slower than the Panther, easier to penetrate. Yet these so-called mediocre tanks, soldiers noted, appeared everywhere, as if in endless supply. One report from Army Group B, under Rommel's command, stated, "The enemy possesses inexhaustible reserves of medium tanks." Officers wondered, how could machines regarded as simple and cheap keep advancing, while their own, more sophisticated tanks broke down even on the march? A week after its capture, the Sherman was loaded onto a rail platform. The Germans didn't destroy it. They protected it. It was treated not as a spoil of war, but as a scientific specimen. Under armed escort, the tank was transported to Kummersdorf, the Third Reich's largest proving ground, located near Berlin. It was there that all captured foreign machines were studied and tested: Soviet T-34s, French Renaults, British Valentines. And now it was the Americans' turn. In the archives, Bundesarchiv, Abteilung für Wehrtechnik, a report has survived, number 21144. Captured tank M4A3 from Normandy has arrived. Condition: operational, minor turret damage, engine functional. Inside the workshops of Kummersdorf, German engineers saw the American Sherman up close for the first time. The machine looked strangely simple. The armor plates were welded, not riveted like on older German tanks. Inside, minimal electronics, straightforward mechanics, wide hatches, and clearly marked levers. Junior engineer Wilhelm Grass wrote in his logbook, "Spacious inside, almost like a tractor. Controls, idiot-proof." But Schäfer didn't share the irony. He examined every component carefully, with respect. The Ford GAA engine drew his attention the most, a V8, air-cooled, adapted from an aircraft design. It was powerful, 500 horsepower, and remarkably resilient. "They have no unnecessary complexity," Schaefer said. And that's what makes the machine survive. Unlike the Germans, the Americans weren't building a perfect tank. They were building a reliable tool for war. In the Third Reich, the engineering philosophy rested on perfection über alles, perfection above all. German designers pursued the ideal machine, flawless mechanics, even if it required watchmaker precision. Every bolt, every shaft was a work of art. But in the conditions of total war, that philosophy became a liability. Tigers broke down on the march, Panthers overheated, and repairs required specialized workshops and trained crews. The Sherman, on the other hand, was built for a sergeant with a wrench. Schaefer understood. These weren't just two different tanks. They were two different civilizations of engineering thought. 2 weeks after the Sherman's arrival at Kummersdorf, Schaefer sent a preliminary report to the Armaments Directorate. It contained only 3 sentences. The M4's design is remarkably pragmatic. Maintenance is simplified. Mass production is feasible. In the margins, an officer had scribbled in pencil, "Interesting, but not heroic." The tests continued every day. Rain, mud, cold. The Sherman never faltered. No overheating, no transmission failures, no cracks in the suspension. When the engineers removed the engine, they were struck by its simplicity. No hidden screws, everything standardized. Every single part was stamped with a serial number. German tanks, by contrast, used unique components that required hand-fitting. Schaefer noted in his journal, "The American is built like a set of Lego. We build clocks, they build tractors, but the tractor works longer." Arguments broke out among the team. Some scoffed. "It's not a tank, it's a tin can. It survives only because there are too many of them." Others countered. "Maybe that's exactly where their genius lies, in simplicity." Engineer Paul Ritter said quietly, "Perhaps that's the true brilliance, simplicity itself." Schaefer said nothing. He felt that this Sherman was a mirror of the entire war, and in it he saw everything Germany had done wrong. After a month of testing, the Sherman had covered nearly 400 kilometers. It started flawlessly at 5 degrees Celsius, plowed through mud, and endured dozens of small arms hits. The mechanics joked that if they gave it a name, it would outlive them all. In his final August 1944 diary entry, Schaefer wrote, "I'm beginning to understand why they're sweeping us away." July the 17th, 1944. A train from France rolls through the gates of the Heeresversuchsstelle Kummersdorf, south of Berlin. On one of the flat cars sits a mud-covered but intact American M4A3 Sherman. Its armor bears the scars of battle, shell impacts, charred paint, and the number USA 306888897. The soldiers stare in curiosity. "An American," someone mutters. An officer steps onto the platform, Oberleutnant Kurt Schaefer, notebook in hand. He removes his cap and runs his palm along the tank's hull as if greeting an old adversary. "Das ist also der berühmte Sherman," he says quietly. "So this is the famous Sherman. Let's see what it can do." The tank is towed into hangar number 4, the main hall for testing foreign armor. In the adjacent bays already stand the wrecks of a Soviet T-34 and a British Churchill. Now, beside them rests the American, a symbol of an entirely different industrial philosophy. That same day, the initial inspection began. Engineers removed the turret, disassembled the engine, and recorded the tank's weight, armor thickness, and road wheel diameter. A photographer documented every step, one photo for each stage of disassembly. Every bolt, every weld was marked with a number and a signature. Schaefer personally oversaw the process. He demanded precision and silence. His assistants were Lieutenant Ritter, a suspension specialist, and senior engineer Wilhelm Grass, a metallurgist. Ritter, staring at the engine, muttered in disbelief. Ein Achtzylinder aus Aluminium. Wahnsinn. An aluminum V8. Madness, Schäfer replied calmly. Oder vielleicht Fortschritt. Or perhaps progress. From the preserved inspection log, Bundesarchiv, Ordnung Abteilung 44-7. Engine, 4 GAA, 8-cylinder 5, 18,000 ccm. Air-cooled, 500 HP at 2,600 RPM. Transmission, 5-speed gearbox, easy to disassemble. Suspension, VVSS, good shock absorption, simple to repair. Schäfer added his comment. The Americans achieved what we thought impossible, a powerful engine without complexity. Everything runs on belts and bolts, minimal adjustments required. That evening, Schäfer made a private note in his notebook. We build machines that make sense to engineers. They build machines that make sense to soldiers. The next focus was the transmission, and it fascinated the engineers as much as the engine. The American gearbox was simple but robust, purely mechanical, with no delicate adjustments, tolerant of operator mistakes. Ritter compared it to the Panther's gearbox. Ours is precise, but unforgiving. The American one tolerated rough handling, didn't seize under overload, and every gear was standardized, made for mass production. Schäfer smiled. It's not engineering poetry. It's engineering logic. 2 days later, metallurgist Grass presented his findings on the armor composition. He had cut a small sample from the Sherman's hull and examined it under a microscope. The result surprised everyone. A uniform structure, with no signs of brittle surface hardening. This isn't hard steel. It's ductile steel. The Germans were accustomed to using surface-hardened armor, hard on the outside but brittle within. The Americans had done the opposite, flexibility instead of absolute hardness. Schäfer explained to the younger engineers, when a German shell hits the Sherman's armor, it bends, but it doesn't break. When our armor is hit, it cracks. That's the whole difference. For completeness of analysis, a Panther and a Tiger were brought in from the neighboring hall. Now 3 machines stood side by side, 3 philosophies of war, the T-34, raw simplicity, the Tiger, engineering perfection, and the Sherman, industrial balance. In engineer K. Ritter's diary, one line stood out. If war were a factory, the Americans would have already won. The Tiger impressed with its size, the Sherman with its practicality. While the German tank required over 3,000 man-hours to build, the American needed less than 1/200. The Sherman was made like bread, in batches across hundreds of factories, all from the same blueprint. Some officers found the test results suspiciously flattering. In the reports, pencil notes appeared. Not representative, single specimen. But the numbers spoke for themselves. The tank had driven hundreds of kilometers without needing repairs to its suspension or gearbox. Tests were conducted at 38 degrees Celsius, yet engine temperature remained stable. Schäfer replied to the skeptics, "You may doubt the figures, but you can't deny that this tank is still moving." A peculiar atmosphere filled the hangar. Each day the engineers faced a living reminder of the enemy's industrial superiority. The pride of German engineering stood against simplicity, and simplicity was winning. Schäfer wrote in his notes, "This is not a triumph. It is a lesson." Some began to concede that perhaps mass production, repairability, and standardization were the real weapons of the 20th century. The August 1944 Armaments Office report listed the numbers. Average cost of a Sherman, $45,000. Tiger, equivalent of $300,000 fuel consumption. Sherman, 1.4 liters per kilometer. Tiger, 4.8 engine life. Sherman, 250 hours. Tiger, 100 grass, wrote in his metallurgical summary, "The Sherman is not a work of art, it is a tool," and added, "and tools win wars." The engineers were astonished by the thoughtfulness of every internal detail. Filters, pumps, cable routing, even the placement of the tool kit. Everything was designed for the soldier, not for the technician. On the inner panel, a maintenance guide was printed directly onto the metal, every lever labeled, every lubrication point marked with an arrow. To a German engineer, it looked like a cheap trick, but in war, it was genius. Schaefer remarked, "They design as if every tank crewman is a student who must have everything explained beforehand. We design as if every mechanic is a professor." By the end of August, Schaefer held a closed presentation for armaments officers. He used a chalkboard and diagrams. On one side, he wrote perfection, perfection. On the other, Zuverlässigkeit, reliability. Then he said, "Our tanks are marvels of engineering, but they can only be built in Germany. They cannot be built by the hundreds. The Sherman is simple and therefore eternal. Simplicity is the new strength." Late that night, after the lights in the hangar went out, Schaefer walked back to the Sherman and placed his hand on its armor. The metal was cold, yet somehow alive. He whispered, "You are not the enemy. You are the future." By August 1944, Schaefer's team had completely disassembled the captured M4 Sherman. The engine, gearbox, axles, electrical systems, all laid out on wooden racks under the lamps in hangar number 4 at Kummersdorf. White chalk outlines marked the floor around each component, like the scene of a crime. Engineers moved slowly among them, micrometers and notebooks in hand. Amerikaner verstehen, dass Krieg keine Bühne ist. Ihre Technik ist ehrlich. The Americans understand that war is not a stage. Their engineering is honest. Kurt Schaefer. He divided the work among the teams: grass, metallurgy Ritter, suspension and drivetrain, junior engineers, electrical systems and wiring, Schaefer himself, engine and armor. Inside the Sherman, there was nothing superfluous. Cables were neatly routed, levers clearly labeled, spare fuses mounted directly on the wall. Even the wires were color-coded, something the Germans never bothered with. One of the mechanics remarked in surprise, "It's like a car, not a tank." Schaefer nodded. "Exactly. And cars win logistics." When the engine was completely disassembled, the Germans were genuinely shocked. Before them lay an 8-cylinder aluminum block, 18 liters in capacity, weighing less than half of their own Maybach HL 230. The components were symmetrically arranged, the valve covers removable without adjustment, and everything designed for field replacement. Schaefer ran his hand along the cylinder sleeves. No excess tubing, no crossing hoses, everything logical, like a tractor engine. He noted in his logbook, "The Ford GAA engine can be replaced in the field. The Maybach cannot." The team reassembled the engine on a test stand and started it. At the first turn of the starter, it came to life with a smooth, steady growl. The operation was soft, the vibration minimal. After 3 hours of continuous testing, no overheating, no leaks. Grass was astonished. How did they do this with so little metal? Schaefer replied, "With industry, not genius." The Germans had always taken pride in their torsion bar suspension. It provided excellent ride comfort, but when damaged, it required disassembling nearly the entire side of the tank. The American VVSS, vertical volute spring suspension, by contrast, looked crude until they tested it. Ritter mounted two identical suspension modules onto a vibration rig, one from a Panther, the other from a Sherman. After 20 hours of continuous oscillation, the German unit began to crack. The American one remained perfectly intact. The report concluded, "The American vertical spring suspension is simple, but indestructible." Grass was astonished. The Americans used thick steel springs, not hardened to the limit. They bent instead of breaking. It was precisely this elasticity that made the tank so durable. Schaefer decided to test the armor's strength. A 20x20 cm plate was cut from the Sherman's hull and placed under a hydraulic press. At 80 tons of pressure, it bent but did not crack. The German equivalent plate snapped at 60. "Their steel works, ours breaks," wrote Grass in his report. The Americans had used electric welding for mass production, something German engineers considered unacceptable for armored vehicles. Now they realized they'd been wrong. The Sherman's welded seams absorbed impacts, while riveted joints on German tanks tended to shear off. Inside the Sherman's cabin, everything was intuitive. The control panel featured clearly labeled gauges, oil pressure, RPM, fuel. The Germans saw this as childish, but in combat, those seconds of clarity could mean survival. On the inner wall was a startup instruction, 8 short lines engraved directly into the metal. Schaefer chuckled. They understand that a soldier doesn't read manuals. By contrast, the Panther required 7 separate steps and assistance from another crew member just to start the engine. At Kummersdorf, everyone began to see. This machine was the product of factories, not geniuses. The Sherman was assembled in 25 plants simultaneously, with every component interchangeable. Even the bolts shared the same thread pitch. Schaefer did the math on the blackboard. In one of our tanks, 2,000 bolts. In theirs, 2,000 identical ones. He paused and said quietly, "That's not stupidity, that's wisdom." Every evening, the engineers sat in the Kummersdorf canteen, drinking coffee in silence. With each passing day, the feeling grew. The enemy was superior not only in numbers, but in thought. Many recalled Goebbels' speeches about primitive Americans and realized how false they had been. Schaefer summed it up simply. "They laugh at our art, and we lose to their factory." In September, the Sherman was reassembled and rolled out onto the open proving grounds. Before a group of observing officers, the tank covered 30 kilometers of rough terrain without a single stop. Oil temperature, normal. Vibration, minimal. For comparison, a Panther was tested alongside it. After 15 kilometers, its transmission overheated and the vehicle had to halt. The log entry read, "The Americans build not for pride, but for purpose." On the night of September 10th, 11, Schaefer wrote in his notebook, "Today I saw an engine that can be replaced in 6 hours. We need 2 days and a workshop. Perhaps we are losing because we fight the war too beautifully." As the tests neared their end, Schaefer gathered his team and said, "We must learn from the enemy. Acknowledging his strengths is not defeat. It is the salvation of reason." He asked everyone to write down their personal conclusions. Ritter wrote, "We love details too much." Grass added, "They understand that time is a detail too." By October 1944, the full 78-page report was completed under the title Erfahrungen mit Beute Panzer M4, Experiences with Captured Tank M4. The final lines written by Schaefer would later become legendary in the Kummersdorf archives. The M4 surpasses not by power or gun, but by thought. Its strength lies in understanding war as work. October 1944. Autumn had come to Kummersdorf, damp, windy, heavy with the smoke of test firing. On the distant proving range, the restored American M4 Sherman rolled into position. Chalk scrawled across its turret read, Test Nonja 48, Beute Panzer, M4A3. On the observation berm stood a line of engineers, officers, and armaments department reporters. At the front, Oberleutnant Kurt Schäfer, wearing a long field coat, gloves on his hands, his expression calm. Feuer bereit, ready to fire. A 75mm Pak 40 anti-tank gun was aimed at the Sherman's side from a distance of 800 meters. The first shot. Thunder rolled across the field. The flash struck the tank's flank. The shell punched in at an angle, stripping paint and steel flakes, but failed to penetrate. In the front row, engineers exchanged glances. A fluke, someone muttered. The second shot, straight to the front plate. A deep dent appeared, but again, no hole. The third, into the turret. The machine shuddered, but stayed alive, still running. Schäfer descended from the observation berm and placed his gloved hand on the armor plate. The metal was warm, but not searing. He spoke quietly. Didn't even penetrate. According to document Nummer 4844, Bundesarchiv, Heereswaffenamt. Target, captured tank, M4A3. Range, 800 meters. Angle, 30 degrees. Hits, 4. Penetrations, none. Fire, none. It was the first time German engineers had witnessed a tank with thin armor survive direct hits from an anti-tank gun. Observing officer Captain Kraus noted in his report, "The armor is not as hard as on our vehicles, yet behaves elastically. The shell's effect is diminished." The next day, they placed a Panther on the same range, same distance, same gun, same angle. The first Pak 40 shot, side hit, complete penetration. The second, rear hit. Fuel ignition. The report concluded, Panther destroyed after 2 hits, M4 operational after 5. The engineers stood in silence. Schäfer spoke calmly. Perhaps it's time to rethink our pride. The next experiment was to test ammunition detonation. The Americans had developed a system known as wet stowage, water-jacketed shell racks that reduced the risk of fire. The Germans had long dismissed it as unnecessary. The Sherman was prepared, live rounds placed inside, a gasoline tray ignited beneath the hull. Flames engulfed the tank. After 10 minutes, it still stood. No explosion. The American system had worked. In contrast, the Tiger failed the same test. Detonation after 3 minutes. Schäfer wrote in his notes, "This is not heroism. This is intellect." 2 days later, the Sherman was started again. Despite the damage, the engine turned over. The tracks rolled forward. Mechanics replaced a broken section of track in 15 minutes, a record. By comparison, replacing a torsion bar on a Panther took 6 hours. Schäfer added, "The Americans think of the soldier. We think of the engineer." From the translated Bundesarchiv document, after repeated shelling, the M4A3 engine remained functional. Armor, no cracks, only dents. Suspension, intact. Further research on fuel safety recommended. It was the first time German records rated a captured vehicle as above average in reliability. That evening, the engineers gathered in the canteen. No one spoke. Finally, Grass raised his coffee cup and said, "Perhaps we didn't lose the war at the front, but in the workshops." Schäfer slowly nodded. During one of the tests, a German mechanic broke a wrench. The Americans, however, supplied a full toolkit with each tank, neatly packed in a box marked ORD. It contained everything: wrenches, bolts, grease, and manuals. The Germans were astonished. Tools were a luxury in their army. They don't just design a machine, Schaefer observed. They design the mechanic. Reports from the front began arriving at Kummersdorf. Field commanders wrote that the Sherman didn't impress at first glance, but it was everywhere. They destroyed them, yet new ones always took their place. From Army Group B report, October 1944, the enemy advances like a wave of steel. Every lost tank is immediately replaced. Schaefer wrote in his journal, "Perhaps reliability is the real weapon." Finally, they conducted the ultimate test, a combined shelling and mine explosion. 6 kilograms of TNT were placed beneath the Sherman's belly. The blast lifted the tank off the ground, yet the hull remained intact. The Germans were stunned. Schaefer stepped forward, removed his glove, placed his hand on the armor, and said, "It saw fire and lived." That line would later be marked in the archives as the unofficial closing statement of report number 21144. By November 1944, the trials were complete. The Sherman was returned to the hangar, resting between a burned-out Panther and a shattered T-34. Chalk on its side read, "He survived everything." Schaefer sent his final report to Berlin. The last line read, "We laughed at it. Now we learn from it." December 1944. Snow drifted over the concrete yards of Kummersdorf. The hangars were cold. The lamps hummed faintly. In the corner of hangar number 4 stood the Sherman, paint peeling, its surface scarred and scorched from months of tests. A machine that had survived fire, explosions, and shellfire, now motionless yet whole. Schaefer sat at a wooden table. Before him lay a thick grey notebook. On its cover, the title, "Erfahrungen mit Beute Panzer M4", Experience with Captured Tank M4. Below it, the date, 14th December 1944. He was not writing for an order, but for himself. These pages were no longer a military report. They were the reflections of an engineer who, for the first time, allowed himself to doubt. "I have seen an enemy who surpasses us not with steel, but with thought." Schaefer began organizing his notes. He opened the technical logs recorded over the past months and rewrote them by hand, as if checking not the numbers, but their meaning. Weight, 30 tons engine, 500 horsepower speed, 40 km/h armor, 63 mm. He stared at the lines, wondering, how could this medium tank become a symbol of superiority? Why did thousands of such machines succeed while Tigers and Panthers broke down? He wrote, "Our tanks are lions, theirs are ants, and the ants are winning." Germany still believed in Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapons. Newspapers raved about rockets, new tanks, secret projects. But inside Hangar 4, reality looked different. Miracles didn't prevent overheating, and ideology didn't fix engines. Schaefer wrote, "Perhaps the true miracle is the thing that simply works." His colleagues were uneasy with such thoughts. In 1944, words like that could bring suspicion, or worse. But Schaefer kept writing. Each page became a confession. He described not only the Sherman's mechanisms, but the human philosophy behind them. "We design for glory. They design for victory. We perfect the tool. They perfect its use." He compared German engineering pride to Baroque architecture, magnificent, yet impractical. The Sherman, by contrast, was like a factory building, plain concrete, but enduring. He recalled the small things that struck him. How the American tank started in the rain, how a track could be replaced in minutes, how a soldier could operate it without manuals. He recorded it all with near religious reverence. "I have seen an engine that serves the man, not the other way around." For a German engineer in 1944, such words bordered on heresy. Schaefer often stayed late in the hangar. He would sit beside the Sherman in the dark, listening to water drip from the ceiling. Sometimes he lit a lamp and traced the dents on the armor with his fingers. Each mark felt like a metaphor for endurance. Now I understand strength, not as never breaking, but as moving forward even when broken. Between the reflections, he copied fragments of official reports by hand, as if wanting to preserve them, not for archives, but for the future. Captured tank M4, outstanding maintainability, ease of service, stable production. Evaluation, exceptionally reliable. One evening, Ritter came in, carrying a cup of coffee. They sat in silence for a long time before Ritter finally said, "If we're honest, Kurt, we've lost." Schaefer nodded slowly. "Perhaps we lost in order to understand." They drank in silence. Outside, air raid sirens wailed. Lancasters droned somewhere over Berlin. The final pages of Schaefer's notebook were titled Erkenntnisse, Insights. Only a few lines filled them. Complexity is the enemy of speed. Simplicity is a form of genius. Reliability is also a weapon. An engineer must think like a soldier, not a philosopher. A tank is not a monument. It is a tool. In February 1945, just weeks before Berlin fell, Kummersdorf was bombed. Much of its archive burned. But Schaefer's notebook survived, edges charred, pages still legible. It was found in 1946 by U.S. technical intelligence officers and sent to Washington. Their report, TI Report 1946, Section E, stated, "Captured notebook by Lieutenant Kurt Schaefer provides unique insight into German recognition of U.S. tank design philosophy, confirms full technical respect for M4 reliability and production logic." Today, the notebook is preserved at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. That spring, the Sherman that had survived every German test was recovered by Allied forces. The chalk writing on its side was still visible. Überlebte alles. He survived everything. Its hull bore scars from the Pak 40, dents and burns like medals. An American officer examining it remarked, "If even the Germans couldn't kill it, that tells you enough." And somewhere, in Schaefer's handwriting, history closed on a quiet truth. Perhaps one day someone will read what we learned here, that perfection without purpose is useless, and that a simple thing that works is greater than a beautiful thing that breaks. January 1945. Kummersdorf prepared its final report on the comparative testing of captured tanks. KPS WW2, Tiger, KPS WW5 Panther, and M4A3 Sherman. The tests continued even as Allied forces crossed the Rhine. For the German engineers, these were the final months of work, a last attempt to record, to understand, to explain. Schaefer sat at a long table in the cold hangar. Before him lay 3 folders: Tiger, Panther, M4. He looked at them as if they were 3 eras condensed into the essence of war: pride, perfection, and reality. The Tiger, an engineering marvel. A turret with 100mm of armor, a KWK-36 gun with a 2,000-meter effective range. Each tank was hand-assembled, almost like a violin, built at Henschel & Sohn in Kassel, 1 per day. The Panther, lighter, more refined, with sloped armor and elegant design, but fragile, demanding perfect maintenance conditions. It was a masterpiece until it moved. Both tanks inspired awe until they broke down. Only 40% of those sent to the Eastern Front ever reached the battle line without transmission failure. Schaefer wrote in his notebook, "Our strength lies in art, theirs in practice." The M4 Sherman, by contrast, looked poor. Flat armor plates, a simple turret, a medium gun. Yet behind that simplicity hid the genius of production logic, a machine that could drive, fight, and be repaired faster than the enemy could criticize it. The Americans had understood a truth that Germany had ignored. Victory belongs not to the best tank, but to the one that gets to the battle. Germany built its tanks as masterpieces, hundreds of unique components, hand-fitted assemblies, endless fine adjustments. In the United States, assembly lines, standardization, interchangeability. One plant built engines, another turrets, a third guns, and every piece fit without adjustment. German reports observed, "The Americans build tanks like tractors, but with the logic of a watch." Schaefer realized that Germany's obsession with precision had become its downfall. While German engineers polished a single part, the enemy produced 1,000 finished machines. Frontline dispatches from Normandy confirmed it. One damaged Tiger meant a week in repair. A hit Sherman was back in combat within a day. The Americans had built a system where breakdowns were part of the process, not a catastrophe. Grass noted in his papers, "Our tanks die as heroes, theirs keep fighting as tools." At a January 1945 meeting of the Armaments Office, an officer challenged Schaefer. "Herr Schaefer, are you claiming the enemy surpasses us through simplicity?" Schaefer replied, "Not surpasses, understands." The room fell silent. A bureaucrat muttered, "That sounds like surrender." Schaefer answered calmly, "It sounds like understanding." In his final Kummersdorf report, he wrote, "Wir bauten Kunstwerke, die nur in unseren Händen leben konnten. Der Feind baute Werkzeuge, die jeder Mann bedienen kann. Wir dachten an Ruhm, sie an Gebrauch. We built works of art that could live only in our hands. The enemy built tools any man could use. We thought of glory, they thought of use." That sentence would later be quoted by American historians as the clearest expression of the M4 philosophy. To demonstrate the contrast, Schaefer arranged a live comparison for visiting officers. 3 tanks stood side by side: Tiger, Panther, Sherman. Each crew was ordered to perform the same tasks: replace a road wheel, change an oil filter, start the engine. Tiger, immobile. 2 mechanics, 1 jack, 3 hours. Panther, slightly better, 1 hour, 45 minutes. Sherman, 17 minutes. An observing officer whispered, "It isn't stronger, it simply thinks faster." In the archives, one chart remains. Ausfall quote, Vergleich, 1944. Failure rate, comparison, 1944. Tiger, 53% immobilized before combat. Panther, 42%. Sherman, 17%. Schaefer's comment below the graph reads, "The result is not courage, it is method." By December 1944, German command documents began using a new term, Kostenkrieg, the war of cost. A new realization had emerged. Victory would belong to the side that produced cheaper, faster, and repaired easier. Schaefer noted that the Americans had understood this first. The true victory of the Americans is industrial, not tactical. By late January, the mood in Kummersdorf was grim. The engineers knew their findings could no longer save the country. But Schaefer kept working, as if the duty of an engineer was to seek truth even as the world collapsed. "If I die tomorrow, at least I'll understand why we lost." In his final summary, he wrote, "The Tiger, invincible in theory, defeated in reality. The Panther, beautiful but fragile. The Sherman, ordinary but indestructible." Schaefer began teaching ideas that once bordered on treason. He told the young engineers, "Engineering is not pride. It is care. A machine must be like a soldier, tired, dirty, but alive." One student recorded in his diary, He taught us that a wrench can be more important than a hero. February 1945. Germany was collapsing. Bombing raids shook Kummersdorf almost daily. But in the basement of hangar number 4, Schäfer finished one last document. Vergleichsbericht über Panzerphilosophien. Comparative report on tank philosophies. Its final line read, "If the enemy has managed to teach us, then he is no longer our enemy, but our mirror." February 1945. The roads of Germany were collapsing under retreat. Endless convoys crawled forward, trucks without fuel, tanks with frostbitten crews, horses dragging howitzers through the snow. Above them, the unending howl of Mustangs filled the sky. Every stop felt like the last one. That same month, a report arrived at Kummersdorf from German intelligence on the Western Front. Über amerikanische Versorgungssysteme, on the American supply systems. Even the most stoic analysts were stunned. Each American unit possesses its own repair trains, mobile workshops, spare engines, and standardized components. Tanks are not repaired. They are replaced. Schäfer read the lines slowly. He understood then that the Sherman was merely the visible tip of a vast system, an industrial civilization that Germany had failed to build. American logistics were not just supply. They were a living organism. Assembly lines, transport chains, field depots. Every bolt on a Sherman had a twin somewhere in Illinois or Detroit. Any crew could replace an engine in a day because every engine was identical. Schäfer wrote in his notebook, "We fight with weapons. They fight with factories." In Germany, every tank was unique. Tigers from different series had incompatible parts. Even bolts had different thread patterns. Engines were built in small batches, and repairs required engineers of professorial skill. On the Eastern Front, entire companies were immobilized for want of a single component. The Americans, meanwhile, shipped parts by the crate, like nails. The American replaces, the German repairs. The difference is time, and time is life. From the Abteilung Fremdgerät report, January 1945. Photographs showed a Sherman on a lift, soldiers in clean gloves working beneath it. The Kummersdorf engineers were astonished. Germans used repair plants. Americans used repair trucks. Schäfer commented dryly, "We move the tank to the repair. They move the repair to the tank." The U.S. Army trained soldiers in field maintenance schools. Every tanker knew how to change filters, tighten a track, replace spark plugs. To the Germans, this bordered on blasphemy. A soldier was not a mechanic. But in battle, those hours saved meant survival. A letter from an American sergeant, U.S. Army Archives, February 1945, read, "We don't wait for help. If it breaks, we fix it. If we can't fix it, we swap it." That simple line became the essence of the American philosophy of war. German officers observing the retreat noted how the roads carrying Shermans seemed endless, column after column, every truck part of a single mechanical bloodstream. From Army Group B report, "The enemy fields an army of wheels. We count tanks, they count axles." Schäfer copied the phrase into his diary and added beneath it, "Und sie haben recht." And they are right. The Germans saw war as a craft, the Americans as production. For Germany, every officer was an artist, for America, a manager. And that difference, Schäfer knew, had decided the outcome. "We had heroes," he wrote. "They had workers, and the workers won." To prove the power of standardization, Schäfer staged a new experiment. In the hangar, 2 Shermans and 1 Panther stood side by side. One Sherman was dismantled to the last bolt, then rebuilt using parts from the other. Result, the tank ran perfectly. With the Panther, nothing fit. Parts had to be filed, drilled, and shimmed into place. Schaefer laughed bitterly. 2 Shermans, brothers, 2 Panthers, strangers. At an armaments office briefing, he presented a new calculation. If the Sherman could be repaired 5 times faster and built 3 times cheaper, then every loss cost the US 15 times less than it cost Germany. He called it the Kostenmultiplikator des Sieges, the cost multiplier of victory. Officers exchanged uneasy looks. It was the first time they heard an engineer measure victory not in guns, but in hours. From Protocol number 945, translated, the American system of spare parts and maintenance is unimaginably efficient. Their victory lies not on the battlefield, but in the warehouse. Soon after, Schaefer received photographs from French sources, endless truck convoys marked with red circles, the symbol of the Red Ball Express, a network of supply routes that kept the front alive 24/7, 20,000 trucks, 23 million tons of cargo, 8,000 kilometers of routes. Turning the photos in his hands, Schaefer wrote, "This is not an army. It is a factory on wheels." By February 1945, German command finally grasped the scale of the gap. While the Reich produced 500 tanks per month, the United States produced 2,000, each supported by spare parts and fuel by the tens of thousands. Grass summarized it coldly. The war was not won by bravery, but by accounting. In March 1945, Schaefer gathered his remaining young engineers. He unfurled a map, red arrows for American supply lines, green for German. The German ones broke off, interrupted. The American lines pulsed like arteries, continuous. "This is not a map of war," he told them. "It's a map of a circulatory system, and their heart beats faster." By the end of March, Kummersdorf could already hear the thunder of Soviet artillery. Engineers hid the archives, but Schaefer left one sheet on his desk, a final note in his steady handwriting. The American victory was no accident. It was a plan, and that plan was called logistics. April 1945. Kummersdorf was nearly deserted. Artillery thundered to the east. Most engineers had been evacuated or sent to the front, but Oberleutnant Kurt Schaefer remained, still in hangar number 4, beside the battered yet unbroken Sherman that had survived everything. He sat at a wooden desk beneath a flickering lamp, writing the last pages of his report, not for his superiors, but for history. He knew the document would not change the war's outcome, but perhaps, he thought, it might one day explain why Germany, the maker of the finest machines, lost to the mechanics of Detroit. In the Bundesarchiv, this final document survives as Bericht Nummer 1745, Geständnis eines Ingenieurs, Confession of an Engineer. It was dated 12 April 1945, the very day Franklin D. Roosevelt died. A symbolic crossing, the end of one leader and the confession of another nation. The first line read, "I write this not by order, but for truth." Schaefer began with technical clarity. He listed the facts: production numbers, repair times, cost ratios, available resources. But between the statistics, one could read the human defeat. "We lost the war of engineers," he added. "Our genius was too complicated, their simplicity too intelligent." He described the Sherman as ugly yet immortal. It is no hero, no miracle, no masterpiece, but it always comes back. For German engineering culture, such words bordered on blasphemy, yet within that heresy lay truth. For the first time, Schaefer called the American tank Lehrer aus Stahl, a teacher made of steel. When he read his report aloud to his remaining colleagues, silence followed. Grass finally said only, "You know they'll never publish this." Schaefer replied quietly, "Then at least someone will find it." From the section Construction und Philosophie, Construction and Philosophy. The American principle is independence. Every part can live without the others. Our machines are operas, theirs orchestras. From Wartung und Einsatz, maintenance and use. The Sherman may die, yet return the next day in another form. It is not a machine. It is an idea. These lines were not technical notes. They were confessions. He remembered 1939, when he had taken pride in German engineering, its precision, its beauty, its national glory. Now he looked at a burned Panther nearby and realized, beauty without purpose is dead. "I love our machines," he wrote, "but they do not love us back." 3 of Schaefer's letters to his wife survive, written between 8 and 15th April 1945. One became famous. "When the war ends, they will say the world was saved by courage, but I believe it was saved by organization." He added, "If you ever see how the Americans build their engines, you will understand why they win." Schaefer kept writing even as the lights in the hangar went out. On the fading pages appeared lines that read like poetry. "We were gods of mechanics. They were servants of motion, and motion defeated God." By May 1945, only a handful of engineers remained in Kummersdorf. They compiled a brief internal document, Technische Erkenntnisse, 1945, Technical Findings, 1945. Its final paragraph stated, "The American military system is founded not on perfection, but on functionality. We admire that which has defeated us." It remains the only official document in the history of the Third Reich that openly expressed admiration for the enemy. In 1946, U.S. intelligence officers discovered Schaefer's report. It was translated and distributed among technical and ordnance departments. An internal memorandum from the U.S. Ordnance Department, July 1946, quoted him directly. "German engineers have at last admitted, reliability is also a weapon." Those words quietly reshaped post-war thought. By the 1950s, German designers working in civilian industries remembered Schaefer's conclusions. They inspired a new credo: Deutsche Präzision, aber amerikanische Praktikabilität. German precision, but American practicality. That formula became the foundation of post-war German industry, from Volkswagen to Siemens, and at its root lay the notebook of an engineer from Kummersdorf. His final entry, dated 20 April 1945, Hitler's birthday, was simple. There were no speeches, no symbols, no victory. Just one sentence, written in pencil beneath the dim light of hangar number 4. "I have learned what humility made of steel means." May 8, 1945. Germany capitulated. Kummersdorf fell silent under Soviet occupation. The once proud proving ground lay in ruin, hangars plundered, papers scattered like leaves across the concrete floor. Among the wreckage stood a single survivor, an American M4A3 Sherman, coated in dust and soot, still bearing the chalked words, überlebte alles. He survived everything. The tank that had endured fire, explosions, and countless tests now stood motionless, a monument not to an army, but to an idea: endurance. Kurt Schaefer was never arrested. When the war ended, he found himself in the American occupation zone. In 1946, he was questioned in Munich as a technical expert, not a prisoner. His testimony was filed in the U.S. Army Technical Intelligence Center report, File 77C, Captured German Engineering Notes. Under the section Beute Panzer M4, the summary read, former Lieutenant Kurt Schaefer confirmed detailed testing of the US M4 Sherman tank at Kummersdorf, proving ground. His conclusions regarding American production philosophy have been assessed as exceptionally valuable. The Americans did not view Schaefer as an enemy. They saw him as a man who had understood the essence of modern war. In 1947, Schaefer joined the engineering department at Daimler-Benz in Stuttgart. His assignment to implement a new manufacturing philosophy inspired by the lessons of the Sherman: simplicity, standardization, reliability. In an internal memo, he wrote, "We must no longer design for the elite, but for the people." That single line captured the spirit that would soon fuel the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. The War of Steel had ended, but from its ruins, a new idea of engineering was born. Not perfection for glory, but function for life. 1950s. The factories of West Germany began to hum again, but they no longer served the same ideals. Gone were the days of machines that demanded geniuses to operate them. Now, engineers built machines for everyone, and when older specialists trained young apprentices, they sometimes mentioned a name once forbidden during the war: Sherman. The tank that shamed us also saved us. In 1953, Stuttgart published a modest technical compendium titled Lehren aus dem Krieg, Erfahrungen der deutschen Ingenieure, Lessons from the War, the Experience of German Engineers. One unsigned article quoted words every engineer recognized, even if no author was given: "True perfection lies in simplification." It was the unmistakable echo of the Kummersdorf report. Schaefer's notebook, recovered by the Americans, was later placed in the National Museum of the U.S. Army. On its final page, a short note in English reads, "Found at Kummersdorf, 1945. The man who wrote this understood the enemy better than most generals." Next to it, behind glass, stands the same Sherman M4A3, fully restored and painted in the original colors of the 3rd Armored Division. The curators preserved the chalked German inscription on its side: Überlebte alles. He survived everything. During the 1960s, American veterans visiting Germany were astonished when German engineers thanked them, not for liberation, but for a lesson. One U.S. tanker recalled, "A German engineer shook my hand and said, 'Your tanks were not beautiful. They were wise.' I never forgot that." The Sherman had become more than a weapon. It became a school of industrial thinking, a silent textbook in steel and grease. Its lessons: simplicity of assembly, interchangeability of parts, standardization of tools, a culture of maintenance over repair. These principles would later evolve into the foundations of lean production, Kaizen, and Six Sigma, the very systems that reshaped global manufacturing. German historians later wrote, "We lost the war, but we won the lesson." The tank that was built as a mass-produced instrument of democracy became the moral mirror for a nation once obsessed with perfection. And the Americans, for their part, respected the honesty of the German confession. A 1952 U.S. Army Ordnance Review quoted Schaefer's words directly: "The strength of the Sherman lies not in its armor, but in its philosophy." That sentence found its way into American military engineering textbooks for decades. Kurt Schaefer died in 1964. In his obituary, the Stuttgarter Zeitung wrote, "He was an engineer who learned humility from a tank." On his desk, they found a single yellowed newspaper clipping, an American photo of a Sherman on parade. On the back, written softly in pencil, were the same words that once marked the tank in Kummersdorf: Überlebte alles. He survived everything. Today, in the museums of Berlin, Dresden and Washington, the Sherman stands, not as a symbol of triumph, but as a reminder. On the plaques beneath its tracks, the inscription reads, M4 Sherman, the tank that won the ground war. And below, the German translation, in smaller letters, und lehrte uns, was wahre Stärke bedeutet, and taught us what true strength means. The engineers who survived the war no longer wished to build monsters. They wanted to build machines that would last, machines that served, not glorified. The reborn German industry of the 1950s became a reflection of that lesson: simplicity, repeatability, balance. The philosophy once forged in Detroit's factories had crossed oceans and ruins, finding new life in the workshops of Stuttgart, Wolfsburg, and Munich. And so, the idea born in American steel, the belief that strength lies in reliability, not in perfection, became the soul of a new Germany. Spring 1960. At an American industrial exhibition in Hamburg, among gleaming new cars and jet engines, stands an old relic, a Sherman tank. Its olive paint is restored, its markings neat, its gun silent. Most visitors pass it by, stopping only for a photo. History already feels far away. But one man lingers. A grey-haired gentleman with glasses and a cane, dressed in a modest overcoat, steps closer. He moves slowly, as if approaching an old acquaintance rather than a machine. He reaches out, lays his palm against the cool steel of the turret, and closes his eyes. For a moment, the exhibition hall fades. He sees the hangars of Kummersdorf, the sparks of welding torches, the engineers with clipboards, the white chalk words on the armor. Überlebte alles. The man is Kurt Schäfer, once a lieutenant, once an engineer who tested this very kind of tank not as a guest, but as an enemy. He whispers softly, almost reverently, Du bist kein Feind, du bist ein Lehrer. You are not an enemy, you are a teacher. Then he adjusts his hat, turns, and walks away through the crowd. He does not look back. The light above the Sherman flickers, glinting across its scarred armor, a silent echo of a war long past, and of one man's final lesson learned in steel.